Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you being here. It's been a long conference day so far, lots of issues and not the most uplifting discussion, I realize. What I want to do in the short space of time I'm given is to just reiterate some of the more general points about international order and regional order in the Sharq region, and then really zoom in on the issue of Russian foreign policy. It's very fortunate that many of the previous speakers flagged up various aspects of Russia's reassertion in the MENA region, but it's also interesting to trying to unpack some of the decisions, moves, and underlying motivations behind the reappearance of Russia in Syria and further afield. Now the shifts are very obvious. Some of you might have read the interview President Obama gave to The Atlantic, where he spelled out the basic points about his foreign policy doctrine and the general spirit of reluctance to intervene. That's more or less the legacy of a decade of interventions under the Bush administration. And whoever takes the helm after the elections, and as of yesterday, it seems much more likely that that will be someone called Clinton rather than Donald Trump. Even if Mrs. Clinton is interventionist in her DNA, and compared to Obama, it's very difficult to envisage active American role in the region at the level that we have been accustomed to see previously. Just one basic fact suffices to explain it, not just public opinion, but the changes at the level of the economy, and now the US is a net exporter of energy. The previous dependence on hydrocarbon, and especially oil imports from the Middle East, has been totally reversed. Of course, it's very easy to say that America will pivot to East Asia and it will downscale commitments to the Middle East, but also Europe. Events keep drawing American policymakers back to the region. The Mosul operation is a clear case in point. But I don't think we are likely to see that level of commitment and dependence and focus on the Middle East and North Africa as in previous periods. Second, the junior partner in the Western Partnership, Europe. Europe had a very bold vision of transforming its neighborhoods in the south in its whole image. But as of today, we see the opposite, that it's the periphery, it's the neighbors reshaping Europe, not Europe reshaping the neighbors. The migrant crisis is the best case in point. But the spirit of introversion, of xenophobia, of exclusion that is settling in, not just in Eastern Europe and countries like Hungary, but in core members of the European Union is really indicative. We'll have elections in France where Marine Le Pen very likely will come to the second round of vote, and that's a proof enough that Europe is heading towards introspection. Brexit, not to forget, indicates the general trend towards fragmentation, and it's very difficult in this day and age to envision a Europe which is interventionist, pushing robustly to expand its norms, rules, ways of doing things, being able to spend political capital. I mean, who will be the leader who will argue in favor of open borders towards the countries of the Middle East, liberalizing trade regimes, let alone liberalizing visa regimes. So that's another absence, not just the US, but Europe is less and less part of the picture. And this void, you have other actors stepping in. Russia is a great example. Remember 2011, the Libya intervention, how Russia more or less bandwagoned with the West when the intervention started. Even before it gave implicit endorsement to the operation, not vetoing it at the UN Security Council. Later on, there were a lot of fingers pointed who was to blame. The then President Dmitry Medvedev took the blame, but we can be certain that Putin, who was prime minister at the time, was not against the decision to give a go-ahead, or at least to endorse the resolution, which was then used as a pretext to start the bombing campaign against Gaddafi. But nowadays we have a very different Russia, one that is prepared to confront the West, and which is using the Middle East to reassert itself, not just as a regional hegemon in its immediate near abroad, but also as a global player. The strategic meaning of Syria is precisely that. Before September 2015, when the operation started, Vladimir Putin was actually a pariah of sorts. He was not talked to by Western leaders. The sanctions were being implemented. Russia was isolated. Actually, Turkey was one of the few friends Russia had in the global arena. It was before the incident. And just a year ago, after the Syrian operation, when Russia exploited the momentum to step in, maybe save Assad, save the regime from total collapse, there was a reversal now. Several attempts, ill-advised, you might add, to have a ceasefire in Syria have been made. Secretary Kerry maybe destroyed his career by talking to Lavrov to try to talk the Russians into being cooperative. Russia is listened to. We discussed Russia in this conference. Maybe 2 years ago, we didn't have bothered to mention the name of Putin. Russia has an ideological mission of sorts as well. It has cast itself as the actor trying to prevent regime change, to be the counter-revolutionary leader. And it has tried to also leverage its new role to get the concessions on issues that matter much more to it. Get sanctions relief, and maybe get some commercial benefits. We shouldn't forget, from a more cynical, kind of immediate policy-making perspective, Syria is one of the first out-of-area operations where the new Russian forces, following several years of military reform, are testing their capabilities and showcasing new hardware, new weaponry that then is sold worldwide. Russia is still a big exporter of arms, and the Middle East is where some of the arms are going. So that's not to be discounted as well, beyond the diplomatic benefits of being a main mover, shaker in Syria and coming to the rescue, and then being one of the patrons of the regimes. Now, what I want to look at next is the limits of Russian strategy. Now, of course, the diplomatic benefits are clear, the gains have been made, but we shouldn't forget that the military resources Russia deploys are very scarce. Maybe they're at the limit of their intervention. Russian policymakers have been very reluctant to expand, to scale up their presence. They have put their bets on air campaign and have resisted deploying ground forces, which is one of the reasons why the Aleppo operation has been so painful, because there hasn't been ground force able to match the force projected from Russian Air Force. Of course, the main victims are civilians captured in Aleppo. But if you read the Russian papers, you see constant indications and complaints by senior military personnel that the Iranians, and especially Assad's forces, are not doing the job, which raises the prospect of being bogged down over time. So there are limits to what extent Russia can project power. Secondly, society doesn't care about Syria. I think you raised this point, how it resonates. Russian society reacted enthusiastically after the annexation of Crimea. But Crimea is an entirely different story. Eastern Ukraine already see the decline of interest as turning to liability. And Syria is not a major issue in public mind. I think there's some sociological data, but also you can see it in the coverage. There is a limit to what extent you can use Syria to boost your domestic popularity, and you don't get much mileage out of it. And lastly, but not least, obviously, there are costs associated with pushing too hard. If you look at the Russian diplomatic strategy in the region, it has tried to strike a balance. Of course, Assad is one of the principal allies, and Iran has turned into a sort of a friend. But there's more to Russia's Middle Eastern strategy. They have cultivated relations with Israel. So there has always been this balancing act between Tehran and Israel. By the way, the Israeli strategic debate has evolved. That many people say that we live in a post-Western world and Israel needs to diversify relations away from the West and reach out to the likes of Russia and China. And Russia has even kept talking to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, trying to maintain good diplomatic relations, maybe even sell weapons down the road. They find themselves in the same boat when it comes to oil prices, and Iran has actually undercut their efforts, or has been undercutting their efforts to control the oil price. So Russia, over time, has been very careful not to side too far with the so-called Iranian Shia axis. And to be frank, we can expand in the questions and answer session. Relations with Iran haven't been as harmonious as people think. So this leads me to the concluding point that there is a void in the Middle East. There are regional powers trying to fill in the void, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Russia has stepped into the fray as well, but it will be too far-fetched to see Russia as a provider, as a supplier of order, capable of replacing the West. We live in an era which is very different from the 1990s, from the unipolar world, but it's also very different from the Cold War. In the Cold War, Russia was willing to sponsor regimes, to spend resources, to project military power in the Middle East, and it could afford to do so, and had the ideological vision, it had the means. We don't live in this world anymore. What we have in Moscow is an actor, is a regime that is opportunistic and will try to make the most of the mess, the chaos in the Middle East, but won't commit beyond a certain level. Thanks for your patience.